When the great global warming swindle went to air in the UK early this year, 2.5 million Britons tuned in. And of the 800 viewers who contacted Channel 4, 6 to 1 were in favour of Martin Durkin's film. One of those against was The Guardian's columnist George Monbiot.
Had that been a responsible piece of programme making, and had there been a genuine case to be made that climate change science was a swindle, well, then that would have been something good. But unfortunately, people were misled into being confused about climate change on the basis of a whole series of fraudulent statements.
The great global warming swindle was perfect programming for Britain's Channel 4. In 1997, Channel 4 was forced to make a prime-time public apology after screening Against Nature, another Durkin film. Channel 4 said that film exposed green ideology as unscientific, irrational and anti-humanist. But Britain's Independent Television Commission said
the editing of interviews with 4 environmentalists in the programme had indeed distorted or misrepresented their known views.
The Great Global Warming Swindle is Durkin's latest production for Channel 4. But who are the scientists in Durkin's film? Frederick Singer's title in the film is First Director of the National Weather Satellite Service. Missing are his dates of service, 1962 to 1964. Furthermore, Singer is sceptical about many things, including the connection between sunlight and melanoma, and between second-hand smoke and lung cancer. Before turning to climate change denial, Singer published papers arguing that the now banned CFCs do not cause ozone depletion.
In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, Professor Frederick Seitz, former president of America's National Academy of Sciences, revealed that IPCC officials had censored the comments of scientists.
Durkin also emphasises an attack on the IPCC by a Professor Fred Seitz. Only when you freeze the image is it obvious the letter was written back in 1996. Unmentioned is Fred Seitz' background. Another passive smoking and ozone sceptic, Seitz was a founder and chairman of the conservative George C. Marshall Institute, funded since the late 1990s by ExxonMobil. Seitz ran into trouble when he published an anti-global warming pamphlet done up to look like an official document of the National Academy of Sciences.
The Great Global Warming Swindle is an exercise in scientific fraud. The man who made it has already been held up for scientific fraud in the past, and yet he has been commissioned to do the same thing again for Channel 4.
Martin Durkin, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tony.
Now, are you seriously arguing that no government needs to take action to rein in CO2 emissions, the international effort to create a new global agreement on CO2 emissions is a waste of time?
Broadly speaking, yes. I mean, I'm certainly arguing that the evidence is such that we shouldn't take the theory of man-made global warming as proven to be true.
So the US government, the British government, the governments of Canada and Australia, most of the EU governments and their scientific advisors, they're all just wrong and in the thrall of some kind of swindle, is that right?
Yes.
By swindle, are you implying a conscious fraud?
I think there's an element of fraud in the debate, which is that the science is overwhelming. It's done and dusted. We now know for sure this is going on. On the contrary, there is an awful lot of, some of the most basic bits of evidence that you would look to establish the truth of man-made global warming are simply not there.
One of the central arguments in your documentary is about whether or not carbon dioxide levels can cause climate change. Here's what you say.
CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Now, are you actually claiming there that because CO2 is such a small proportion of the atmosphere, that it can't be a climate-forcing agent?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean that it's completely obvious that it should be a climate-forcing agent.
You're not saying that it isn't a climate-forcing agent?
Well, no. I mean, CO2 is a greenhouse gas and, does affect us as other greenhouse gases do. But it's a very small greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gases themselves only form a relatively small part of the Earth's climate system.
Here's how climatologists we spoke to responded to that.
This idea that the amount of something is proportional to how important it is clearly silly. For instance, if I injected you with a little Ebola virus, that's a tiny, tiny amount of something, but it would have an immense impact on you, and you would die. So the amount of something is not in any way proportional to how big an impact it might have, and carbon dioxide's the same.
I mean, the ozone is far less of a concentration in the atmosphere than CO2, but we know the effects of increased UV.
Are you saying they're simply wrong?
Well, if you look closely at even what all climatologists, even on the side of those people who believe in global warming, say, they all admit that the existence of CO2 in the atmosphere is such a the CO2 in the atmosphere is such a small proportion that there need to be some amplifying effect for this small amount of CO2 to have the effects that are being claimed for it.
But the scientists that we spoke to look at this very differently.
The natural sources of carbon dioxide through the breathing of the planet is many, many times the amount of carbon dioxide that human activity produces. But over billions of years, the planet has developed its own mechanisms for taking back up from the atmosphere that amount of carbon dioxide. So there's a natural balance between the breathing in and the breathing out of the planet. What we've done is change that natural balance. By adding significant amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we have upset that natural balance such that we can now observe billions of tons of carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere that we can prove is the result of human activity.
So what do you say to that argument put forward by Andy Pittman and others?
I think it's absolute rubbish. I mean, the number of people who argue that there's some kind of natural equilibrium in the atmosphere and the Earth's climate, I mean, it is one of the most absurd ideas, and it's propagated by a lot of people who really ought to know better.
Here's another contentious claim in your film. Again, it's based on the historical record. You claim that the period between the 9th and the 13th centuries was hotter than today. Let's look at that.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
Now, do you still stand by that claim?
Yes.
Here's what our climatologist said about that.
When I saw this picture, which shows the medieval warm period warmer than now, and the right-hand side says now, this picture's 20 years old. All the data since then has come off the top.
There is little doubt that the last 5 or 7 years has been warmer than any time in the medieval warm period, and that's what we're absolutely certain about.
So to show a graph that's 20 years out of date, not to show what happened at the end, not to report the reports, that's just a lie.
So the question is, why didn't you use the latest or even the recent IPCC charts?
Because the IPCC charts that they'd like me to use aren't reliable. The reason why we used that was that it was a very famous graph produced by Herbert Lamb, who's
What year was that?
Early 90s, I think.
Why did you use a graph that was 17 years old when you could have used more modern data which shows what's happened in that past 17 years?